heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 331, covering the week of October 24th through October 28th, 2022. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, like our Gab and our Facebook page, and subscribe to our YouTube page. Our YouTube page is invaluable. Right? We've got so much good stuff on that. We'll talk about that this week again. We had another great video from Don Livingston from our summer school, but we've got so much good stuff on the YouTube page. And if you're there, click on that little heart under the videos, that super thanks button. You can throw a few pennies our way and help keep all this stuff going. That said, we do exist on your generous contributions alone. We're coming up to the end of the year. Here we are, last week of October. And if you're making plans, financial plans for your taxes for 2022, consider a tax-deductible donation to the Abbeville Institute to the full extent of the law. I mean, we cannot do all these things without your support. I just saw a video just before I recorded this from John Stossel on the SPLC, for example. They have over $300 million in an endowment. Well, we have nothing near that. Imagine if we had that kind of money. Now, if you know somebody with $300 million, put them in touch with us. But regardless, if you've got $5, if you've got $10, if you can donate $10 a month, if everyone on our email list and this podcast donated $5 or $10 a month, we would be in business, right? So please consider those donations. We've got a lot of good stuff that we're trying to work on behind the scenes, and so we do need financial support and contributions to do that. Also, just want to let you know and kind of give you the heads up, April 13th through 16th, 2023, next April, we have our 20th anniversary event. It will be at Callaway Gardens in Pine Mountain, Georgia. There will be a web page for it to register very shortly, within the next week or so. We'll have that up. So you're going to want to register for the conference. It's going to be fantastic. We already have great confirmed speakers, of course, Don Livingston, Paul Gottfried, Tom Fleming, myself, Clyde Wilson. On and on. We're going to have such a grand time there. It's going to be, Tom DiLorenzo is going to be there. It's going to be fantastic. So you're going to want to come to this thing. It's going to be a celebration of 20 years of the Institute. We've got some pretty neat stuff that we're going to do. And it's at beautiful Callaway Gardens, which is in itself an expression of the Southern tradition. So it's going to be well worth your time. If you do like all the things we do, share them around on social media. Go on to Facebook, share the material around, or go on to Twitter, or wherever you can share your material, Gab, whatever it is, and share these articles that we publish. We do appreciate you sharing around that material and letting people know about it. If you like the podcast, rate, review, and subscribe to it. Give it that 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Leave a text review on Apple Podcasts. If you're on the YouTube channel, comment. That helps the algorithm. Also, watch the videos all the way through if you can, or put them on 2 times speed to get through them faster. Whatever you got to do, that does help. If you just watch a part of it, YouTube doesn't look at it the same way if you watch the whole thing. So watch the videos, just leave it on. If you don't want to listen to the whole thing, just put it on 2 times and go through it, and that way more and more people will get these videos. It's very important that we get the message out there. And again, all that stuff is free of charge. Most of the things we do are free of charge. But we do appreciate your support. A couple of things. People have asked about the app, the mobile app. We're working on that to try to get that fixed. So Apple has it again. They took it down, not because of anything nefarious, just because there was a little snafu in how that works. So we're trying to get that back up. That should be back up relatively soon. And also remember, we have our Abbeville Academy, which is a great way to pick up these old lectures that we've done through the Zoom webinars. We are going to have a number of these again next year. Our last one was a couple of weeks ago. It was a Friday event, excuse me. We might do them on Saturday. It was 4 speakers, so we're going to have more of these. So we're still going to do the 1 speaker events, the 1-person webinars on weeknights. We might have them on weekends if we have more speakers, but we're going to do more of that. Maybe 1 more this year. We'll see what I can come up with to try to get that going. And, of course, be on the lookout for those as well. We're going to try to plan out everything we can for the future for the Institute. Okay, so let's talk about the material this week. And I want to start with a piece that we ran on Friday by Lafayette Lee. Now, this was not originally published at Abbeville Institute. It was published at a website entitled I Am 1776, or I'm 1776. And I talked about it on my own podcast. If you don't get that one, it's the Brian McClanahan Show. You can look it up on wherever you get your podcast. But it's a really good piece because it talks about tradition. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I go through it in extensive detail on my own show. But I do want to mention what this piece means. First of all, he's critical of the Lincoln myth. He's critical of the righteous cause myth. He's critical of the idea that we have a proposition nation. And he's supportive of things like think locally, act locally, decentralization, the real principles of American conservatism. It is a great, great piece. And the response to it from the Straussians, from the Lincolnites, has been scorn. Right? They think that Lee doesn't know what he's talking about, that this idea that somehow tradition can anchor these things is a faulty idea. It doesn't work. And that tradition alone is not sufficient to lead to a revitalized community. Now you have to understand it's the Straussians that believed that what they call the regime, which is the United States, is going to end. Now that term regime has been used by a lot of people. Rush Limbaugh talked about it all the time. He said we have a regime, the Obama regime, the Biden regime. You could say it was the Trump regime. And of course, that's accepting this Lincolnian myth that what we have is a centralized state. The left has started to figure out that the attacks against centralization are pretty spot on in that if we really adhere to the original document, the original Constitution, their whole world would fall apart. So what essentially they say is that, okay, well, we've had a transformation. We had a revolution in 1861, and that revolution produced this new order where we have top-down, centralized, one-size-fits-all government led by, of course, Lincoln at that point, and then the Republican Party. And the 14th Amendment, most importantly. So what Anton and the Straussians are essentially doing is echoing leftist talking points, and particularly leftist talking points from the 19th century. This is where Dabney, who we had a great webinar about with Zach Garrison, fantastic webinar, it's at the Abbeville Academy site, this is where Dabney was so critical about conservatives, quote unquote, in the 19th century. They just were picking up discarded leftist talking points and saying this is conservatism, when he knew it wasn't. It wasn't conservatism at all. There was nothing to it. It was all leftist, progressive drivel. So it's important to note that the Straussians, again, are simply echoing 19th century liberalism, which is not conservatism. In fact, they made fun of conservatives. But this piece by Lee is so good because he wants to talk about tradition, people, place. What is real patriotism? We've had Clyde Wilson write about that a number of times at the Institute and other places. But what is patriotism? Well, it's not nationalism. It's not my country right or wrong, my country, nothing but my country. It's a defense of real tangible things, the people around you, the place you're from, the traditions you have. When most people went off fighting for America, quote unquote, that's what they were fighting for. They weren't fighting for some metaphysical thing, some ideology. We're going to bring liberty to these people. They weren't fighting for that. They were fighting for something real. And it was a defense of where they were from. For Lee, who served in the United States Army and signed up because of the global war on terror after 9/11, it was because he wanted to defend a tangible thing, which is where his people were from and his traditions and his family. He thought they were under attack. And I'm sure a lot of people joined the United States military in that time period, the early 2000s, because of that exact thing. And then he talks about how disillusioned they became and how they realized the curtain was, when you pull back the curtain, oh my gosh, you've got this Lincolnian nightmare underneath it. And when you have the Straussians say, we're not fighting for these things, we're not fighting for some empire, we're not imperialists, they are. Lincoln never was an imperialist, he was. The Republican Party was talking about extending out to go fight for Cretan independence, for goodness sake, when William Seward was Secretary of State. We could extend this everywhere, right? We could just have a perpetual democracy and liberty revolution and spread it out. And of course, that Lincolnian push becomes so much part of it. I think that when the Straussians say that Lincoln never did that, they don't really know diplomatic history. They don't know it at all. Look at 1896. Look at the Spanish-American War. Those are Republicans. William McKinley was a Republican, a Union veteran Republican, a Lincolnian. It's what he was. He prided himself on that. And we go to war to help Spain, to bring them liberty and democracy, right? So Lafayette Lee, I think, is hammering this in this piece on Friday. Dark Age Patriotism is the title of the piece. We put some of it on the website, and then you have to click the link to go to the rest of the article at IM 1776. But that piece actually works very well with Casey Chalk's piece that we ran on Thursday. And look, this piece is a very personal piece, an inheritance of love. And he talks about, something that happened. He was on an airplane, saw a friend from high school, they got to chatting, and her whole world was different than his. And he says, look, it's place that I love. It's the place that made me who I am. He says, perhaps another way to put it is that I had an inheritance. When the Straussians say that nobody has an inheritance if they weren't born here, right? They don't have the inheritance. If they came after the war, for example, they didn't inherit anything. And look, the person that he was talking to, right? The person he was talking to was not from, her family was not originally from the United States. I think she might be a first generation, born first generation American. He says, that's when I realized where the great gulf between us true today. If I had partied hard, let my grades slip, and fallen into the wrong crowd, my parents would have been deeply disappointed. In truth, my senior year, I several times forged my mother's signature on a note so I could go play hooky with friends. He said that besides that, I had the rest of my family, grandparents, aunts, uncles. On Sundays, we grabbed lunch with my uncle from rural northwestern Virginia, who attended the same church. One set of grandparents lived 10 minutes from us. And he says, perhaps again, I had an inheritance. And I don't mean a financial or material one. The inheritance bequeathed to me was much deeper than that. It involved a faith, one that had been in my family for well over millennia. It involved a story, one of blood relations who had fought in just about every major American conflict since the Civil War. It involved land, ancestors who had tilled the earth in Virginia, Louisiana, and Kansas. And it involved a community, ancestors who had started successful businesses and helped found churches, who had put down roots. He says, I felt all of that, albeit incoherently as a teenager. I'd been given something, a gift hard won that others had bled and sweat to attain over centuries. That gift was mine to accept or refuse, because I was well acquainted with many of those who labored for that gift, and they loved me. How could I refuse? I suppose with a good dose of divine assistance, I chose rightly. Then he says this, what separates me from my old high school classmate most essentially is our inheritance. She, a child of immigrants, had no deep connection to the Old Dominion. If anything, her difficult upbringing likely made her less interested in Virginia. Flee the pain and follow the fleeting opportunities for happiness. That seems to be the guiding principle of her life. Perhaps if I was in her shoes, I'd feel the same way. So he says, look, and this is where Anton would say, aha, see, there, I don't have that same inheritance you have. My family came here after the war. We don't have this generational thing. We don't have this tradition. We can't have this tradition. But I think that Casey Chalk would say, even though he has this deep tradition that he's tied to, it doesn't necessarily mean she couldn't have that as well, this child, this daughter of immigrants. She couldn't have it. It doesn't mean she couldn't have that. She chose not to have that. And maybe it's because at one generation she can't have that. But I think, again, this is because of a lack of education. Chalk's education was built around the family, not in the school. I'm sure in the school, this woman was told all the proposition nation myth, all of these things, transiency, enterprise, economics, America is an idea, America is an economy, just go wherever you want, do whatever you want, America is libertine. That's what we're taught, and this is essentially what the Straussians are doing. The proposition nation myth. Immigrants can't hold on to this long, deep-seated thing, but we know immigrants over generations did do just that. Now, Chalk wants his kids to love what he loved, right? And to love where he's from. And he says, this keep Dixie alive through a century and beyond because his children are going to know it. And that connection to people in place and past is what Lafayette Lee is talking about. And this makes people like Michael Anton uncomfortable because he doesn't have that. But that's okay. you can have that even if you don't have these long-standing roots. You can still believe in this rooted thing: people, place, community. And when we look at the other pieces of the week, like Valerie Protopappas' Do Motives Matter, we've talked about this piece before. I ran it again. She asked, based on something we ran last week, it should matter. And it's Northern Studies, but what she really does with this piece, again, is point out how traditions, how we don't have this one-size-fits-all system, how we have a decentralized federal republic, how Lincoln messed that up in the 1860s, and that became the glaring shift in America. Just as Lee talks about in his piece, this is what Valerie Protopappas is talking about in her piece. Lincoln changed America. Lincoln created the environment where someone like this immigrant, a daughter of immigrants, who Casey Chalk is talking about, doesn't feel a connection to anything because it's just this idea. It's an idea. And in many ways, I mean, this is what look, the Straussians don't get it. Joe Biden sits there and says America is an idea, and yet they're saying in America is an idea. Well, wouldn't that give you pause if Biden, who has gone left, I mean, look, Biden from 1980 is not Biden from 2022. Biden, who's gone left, would say America is an idea, an idea, as he says. America is that. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men or women created. And he cites the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments instead of the real declaration. When he does that, right, we're based on an idea, and you can see how they would connect. I mean, Seneca Falls, 1840s, right? Before Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, but they're doing the exact same things. The Declaration of Sentiments, they're attaching the Declaration to some kind of leftist cause. Can't they see it, right? And if that's all it is, if America's just an idea, then there's no real roots to that at all. You can have that anywhere, at any time, in any place, and you don't need roots. You don't need to put a house in and have a family and do all those things that are important and stay in one area. That's not necessary. It's rootless. And we've moved away from that. I think a lot of Americans, younger Americans, are starting to see the benefit of this, of roots, even if they didn't have them originally, but to actually do it. There's been studies about this. Kids that move around all the time, kids that don't have an anchor, they're far less successful, and they're much more unhappy. You have a place, a stability, a thing. It makes you what you are. It makes you who you are, where you're from. I mean, this is important. Southerners ask where you're from because that matters. It makes you who you are. It's not just your family, but who you are is often determined in many ways by the community which you're around. And if you're around this or that, you're going to reflect that. These are real things, right? People that are around communities, they become like those communities. So when you look at what Protopappas is saying about the founding and how motives matter, right? How these different things, different ideas of decentralization, all that mattered. And then you take a fraud like W.J. Cash, who there was a good piece about Cash this week by Ryan Hall. And the fact is, Cash, as he says, is a charlatan. He thinks to know the Southern mind, but in fact, he's not really that keen on what the Southern mind really was. In fact, the title of this piece is W.J. Cash, The Portrait of Dorian Gray as a Young Southern Man. And his conclusion is great. He says, I would actually argue that Dorian Gray is the perfect analogy for Southern historians like W.J. Cash and Southern politicians who feel the need to be relevant and accepted by non-Southern groups like the mainstream media or woke university elites. So willing are they to sell out their Southern soul and heritage for a bowl of Esau's pottage that they enter into a devil's bargain that gives them unnatural long life and beauty in the eyes of the academic ivory tower or the political halls of Washington. Instead of aging with the dignity of a distinguished Southerner true to the traditions, that might aid our current ills, their true soul descends into libertine madness and distortion to the point that then when they die, no one recognizes them as Southern. Like W.J. Cash, they are simply another corpse that has been sacrificed to the Moloch of globalist elitism as they find that the true Proto-Dorian endarkment of the West has come not from the Southern tradition, but the siren call of a dying secular West. It's exactly right. This is what Lafayette Lee was saying. Traditions matter. The tradition offers reasons why we should be doing X, Y, or Z. The tradition can help save America, and that most important part of it politically is federalism, but there's many other things involved in this, like we talked about with Casey Chalk, an inheritance of love, people, place. Real patriotism. Not some abstraction, not some metaphysical thing that doesn't mean anything, but a real tangible thing. That's such a key to understanding what we do at the Institute. The Institute is dedicated to exploring what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition. What are those things? I've said it on this podcast many times. The Southern tradition is like a rose. It has thorns, but you love the flowers, or some have called it a garden. Boyd Cathy wrote a great book on the Southern tradition. Clyde Wilson produced a couple books that were essays in Chronicles magazine. They're so good. Maybe someday I'll go through those and we'll start looking at printing some of that stuff. But I mean, the Southern tradition is what we're going to explore next year in April. The Southern tradition for the 21st century. What does it offer? What critique of America does it offer, and what solutions does it offer for America? What did Southerners through generations, what can they teach us? Richard Weaver in the Southern tradition at Bay said, look, nobody wants to live in the Old South, and I'm paraphrasing, but it could teach you how to live. Nobody wants to live in that, but it can teach you how to live. There are certain things in the Old South that are timeless. When the Straussians like to call us, time-bound, the tradition itself is timeless. Chalk's tradition from Virginia and all these other places, which was an agrarian tradition essentially, is timeless. It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter if this immigrant, this daughter of immigrants, she could inherit that tradition because she is here on the shores of the United States and she has been part of this experiment. She's been part of this polity, part of this federal republic. It can be part of her. And maybe you don't want to be a farmer, and that's okay, but a lot of people don't want to be farmers. It's hard work. Most people wouldn't cut it. Yours truly included. But the fact is, there's something to that agrarian tradition that matters. It's rooted in something. Maybe it's just you try to stay in the same place and you try to keep your family close. You don't advocate your children when you have them going off all over the world when they could do something remarkable for their own place and help their own community and be part of that. Now, I know different economies and things, it's tough, but with the internet and other things that we have, maybe they could find something to do in these rural areas. It's hard. Rural areas are dying. And they're dying because of big corporations and other things. And this is another, what did the Southern tradition say about corporations? Can we not be critical of corporations through the Southern tradition? What does Southern tradition say about capitalism? Markets are great, but they're not everything. Does capitalism not wear people down in a way? It's not Marxist to say it, but it creates an inhumane environment at times. This is where, when you have George Wallace debating William Buckley, and Buckley is critical of Wallace because he supports old age pensions and education and other things. That's not really conservative. Is it? Is it not? It's a type of conservative, Southern conservatism. It's a humane type of conservatism. And it also is federal because George Wallace wasn't saying, well, I need to have an old age pension for New York. He just did it in Alabama. We're going to have a community college system for the United States. No, it's for Alabama. It reflects the political culture and the people of Alabama, where he was the governor. That's important, right? These are important things to understand. It's not just applicable to everything. One size fits all. We have regionalism for a reason, right? I mean, what might work in New England doesn't work in the South, and what might work in California doesn't work in the Midwest. This is why we have these things, because people and place matter. And if it's just some metaphysical idea, it doesn't necessarily work. That's transiency. A tradition is not transient. An idea is transient. It's transiency, and you can't do that. And this is what Lee is talking about. This is what Chalk is talking about. It's what Valerie Protopappas is talking about. And when you look at Don Livingston's piece, How the North Prolonged and Profited from Slavery, it's part 2. It's the video. I said we're going to talk about YouTube. These videos are on YouTube, free of charge, by the way. You go out and watch these videos if you couldn't attend the summer school, and you can get the education from them. And this idea of Northern complicity in these things, it's ideological. They have this myth, this counterfeit virtue, right? This myth of being the good guys and they did nothing wrong. But as Livingston points out in this video and the one before it, he pokes holes in all that stuff. Now, some Northern historians are starting to turn the fingers back on themselves, and they're starting to reflect and say, well, maybe the Southerners who were saying these things had a valid point. Now, they don't say that, but this is what they're doing. I'll never forget, just a couple of weeks ago, Kevin Levin, who I call Kevin Levine just to poke fun at him, said, oh my gosh, the North, Jim Crow. And I mentioned this last week on the podcast too, the North. And oh my gosh, this is something new. C. Van Woodward had talked about this for 50 years. 50 years ago he brought this up, the strange career of Jim Crow. And it's like the Northerners are discovering this for the first time. A Southerner, C. Van Woodward, was pointing this out. And this is where I say about people like Noah Feldman and Eric Foner, who are essentially now agreeing with the position that what we had is a second American Revolution. That Southerners were actually right about this. The entire structure of society, that William Dunning was right about this. The entire structure of society was uprooted, not just social structure, but also economic structure, political structure, diplomatic structure. All of that was uprooted and changed in the 1860s. And they'll point to the 14th Amendment as the second founding. And look, the original Constitution is gone. It was changed by Lincoln, and then we got the 14th Amendment, and that's the second founding. And that's what we should be looking at for a new American order. So this lecture by Livingston, I'm not going to go through it, but his arguments are that the North never put forward a compensated emancipation plan. They never did anything that they were idealistic, but never really practical about anything. And so their arguments are pretty sorry, right? I mean, they're short-sighted and hypocritical, and they don't look at their own complicity in the institution, which of course is there's a great book by Farrow, I think, is the author, Complicity: How the North the North and Slavery. I can't remember the subtitle, but the title is Complicity. But it's Anne Farrow is the author. There are several authors. She's, I think, the primary author. And these are journalists, and they were going out and finding, oh my gosh. You mean, look at all this stuff here. Look at all these things that we were doing that are just part and parcel of this slavery thing. And so they were shocked by it. And there's actually another book, this is by a professor at South Carolina, and it talks about Dutch families in New York and Dutch families in New England, and the New England area, New York, New England area, that were large plantation owners, slave owners. And it's a review and look at that particular part of Northern studies. So I think turning the fingers back on the North is a good, profitable thing to do. And I say profitable, not make money, but profitable intellectually. Because it shows several things. One, the South wasn't really that peculiar. The North actually became the peculiar other when it did some things differently, particularly with economy. But how a Northern view would eventually be foisted on the rest of the United States, and how that is the real key to understanding where we are in America in 2022. The Southern tradition is viable because of Lafayette Lee and what he says about it, right? It's people, place, community, Casey Chalk. That's what I want you to get out of these pieces. They're nice stories. They're nice pieces. But there's that underlying theme of tradition, people, place, real, tangible, rooted things, not some metaphysical idea that doesn't mean anything. It creates transiency. And that person that Casey Chalk was talking to on an aircraft from high school that never really was rooted in anything. It was just, these are the things we do. America is freedom. America is free to do whatever I want. America is libertine, as Hall points out. It's libertine. America is that. And of course, we know the tradition is not that. And what the Straussians advocate leads to that. All right. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Until next time, good day.